Kia ora koutou and welcome to the second of our Leading for Wellbeing webinar series. I'm Rachel Preble, I'm the Organisation Development Manager at Kaplan Coast District Health Board, and I'm a member of Kahui Oranga, which is the group that have worked together to produce this webinar series for you. The aim is that these kōrero will provide you as our leaders with some food for thought and offer some practical examples and some ideas to strengthen your confidence and your ability to lead for wellbeing. A reminder that during the webinar, you're welcome to submit questions. We've had a few come in to date, but if you'd like to ask a question, use the chat button. Today, we'll be exploring our role as leaders in supporting our diverse workforces and focusing on the idea that when we're weathering life's storm, we're all in the same boat. I'm really excited to be joined by two fabulous colleagues today. I've got Chris King, who is our Chief Allied Professions Officer for Capital & Coast and Hutt Valley District Health Boards. Kia ora, Chris.
Kia ora. Kia ora, everyone.
And Tofa Sofola-Gush, who's our Director of Pacific Health for Hutt Valley District Health Board and currently acting for Capital & Coast. Talofa.
Talofa audience.
So early in the COVID-19 pandemic, the phrase "we're all in the same boat" was a really common catchphrase, and it was really useful in galvanising the team of 5 million and getting us to act with unity and in pursuit of our shared purpose of beating COVID. But it quickly has become apparent that, particularly with regard to wellbeing, not only are we not all in the same boat, but for many, even the size of the storm varies hugely from person to person, from whānau to whānau. So this is of course the case for your health workforces as well. And as leaders, we have a real role to support the wellbeing of our people. The title of today's webinar, Ma pango, ma whero, ka oti te mahi, reflects both the reality of our health workforces as in the sense that we encompass a wealth of diversity, but also recognises that diversity is a taonga to be treasured, that we gain strength from that diversity, and that in fact it's the diversity that helps us to succeed in what we do. So Chris, when you consider this idea that we aren't all in the same boat, what initially comes to mind for you?
So when I reflect over the last 6 months, I professionally lead across a wide range of professions, so we see that diversity every day. But I think it's been really interesting in terms of our COVID experience to see that it's probably brought it home for us as leaders that sometimes we forget that our workforces have their own personal lives. So quite often it's brought it home in respect that maybe we've been used to seeing the pharmacist or the nurse turn up in their scrubs, and that's the role and that's the person we see in front of us. But it's become much more evident that that nurse has got a wee child at home, and that daycare has been closed during the last period of time, and that mum and nurse's stress. We may have a social worker who is from the UK and their father is terminally ill, who hasn't been able to get back to the UK. So I think that whole we're all in this together, but we have different experiences and way of viewing our experience has become more evident. And I think it's also because we've got to know a lot more about our staff's personal circumstances. One more point I found really interesting is a bit of a reflection, and it'll be interesting to see if other people have found this as well, is that over this period of time, even the professional groups across our health workforces out in the community and in the hospital, there's been actually even some differences we've witnessed and observed of the different groups experiencing different anxieties or just the way it's impacted them differently too. And I think that's something to think about too.
So really bringing home that reality that whole people work in our workplaces, not just a profession, not just a uniform, or not just a workplace.
Absolutely. You know, some of our workforces will have partners who have lost their jobs during this situation, financial stress. So it's just remembering that.
Tofa, what about for you? What comes to mind when you think about this idea that we aren't all in the same boat?
Yeah, similar to what Chris has shared. And I think when we think of diversity, we have to accept that, you know, not all of us are from the same background or, you know, the same, professional in terms of working in health. Yeah, one of the things that I often think about when we talk about these things, and it's almost like in a boat, but not in a boat. So, you know, you take your your personal health, your spiritual, your social being, you know, and physical, and all these elements. I think we need not to neglect them, you know, like ensure that as managers and as leaders of the organization, ensure that we know that. And the, you know, the thought of having to know your staff well, so that you can then say, okay, so, you know, in this last 6-7 months, you know, as Chris referred to earlier, some of our staff have gone through many things that, you know, perhaps you and I haven't, but it's understanding that, and actually, you know, that the personal connection, but also understanding the personal circumstances of each staff. And that, you know, because that's a point of difference. You know, that's a point of difference, that we aren't, you know, in the same place. But it's up, you know, for us as managers, we need to ensure, or, you know, be deliberate in having to say, actually, you know, your own learning and your own being as a leader is to be deliberate in making sure that you are in that space with your, you know, with your staff or with the workforce that you are, you know, you are leading.
So for you, maintaining that really deliberate focus on understanding and knowing your people has been really crucial. Have there been particular things that you've done to help you to achieve that, to maintain that focus? Yeah,
I think, you know, many of the things, and I am the director of the 3 hospitals, so to speak. So that means you do 2 days here, 1 day here, and 2 days here. But, you know, there are things that you can do. You can actually meet them face to face, but you have to be deliberate in that effort. Of course, it's the technology that works and so on. So, but it's also like, you know, the personal touch in terms of having to pick the phone up. You know, when a staff is away for a couple of days, pick the phone up and make that connection, because then you'll know much more about their circumstance at that point in time, so that you can actually think about, okay, so how do we support him or her, you know, at this point in time. So
so using those tools to help support that and maintain that focus. What about for you, Chris? How have you maintained that focus on the diversity of experience and needs that staff may have?
So I think through a couple of different mechanisms. I think firstly, from a formal practical solution, has actually been having staff forums, leaders forums. So we've done that for a number of our allied health, scientific and technical leaders during the COVID period. It's a function we normally had, but we ramped it up. And we did that because that was what we were being, I was hearing and they were asking for in terms of communication. So I think some practical solutions, actually getting people together, so then we are hearing what is really going on for our leaders. And that's been a really good mechanism to hear for those leaders what they're telling us about what's going on for their teams. So, I mean, again, many of you on the webinar here, you will be working in different locations from some of your teams and have big and small and diverse teams. So you've got to think about lots of different ways to do this. But I think what I've valued during this time as well is also talking to my colleagues as well and going, because we've all got different spans of influence in areas we work in health, don't we? So actually talking to our colleagues, what's going on for you? What are you seeing? And I think especially in this time when actually those of us that may be more based in facilities or hospitals really need to know what's going on for our community providers and our aged residential care and our private providers. So having those conversations and asking our colleagues who work in those spheres, what is going on for you and your staff, I think has been, I've seen that blossom during this period when potentially, so some connections have been created, which I think is going to be good for the long run as well.
And people starting to think beyond perhaps their own context, but out into where they interact across the system.
And how we can help each other, and therefore we're more willing to engage and have conversations and help each other.
So in our first webinar, Dame Nada Glavish talked about the notion of self-awareness and of self-care as essential to leading for wellbeing. As leaders, when we're trying to understand and walk in the shoes of others, how does our own worldview influence our ability to do this effectively? Chris, do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, we've all come from different countries, we're born into different families, we all have different genetics and behaviours and environments. So of course, the way we react and view the world is going to be different. So I think, first of all, one of the most important things is to be, reflection, to reflect on your worldview, to actually stop and take a moment to think, how have I viewed that situation and how have I reacted? Because I think if we can start to do that, again, I'm not saying, you know, you've got to stop and pause yourself with some of these things, don't you? Then you're more likely to be aware of how you are responding to the situation and or to other team members or those you are leading. You may not be responding in the same way, but you first of all need to understand how you are responding to the situation. I think also some of us we will come with our own lens, and sometimes it may be very narrow because the areas we work in may just be this service, where some, you know, we're not seeing other areas. So I think, again, remembering that we are only seeing part of a potential bigger picture is important. And I think, and just another thing to reflect on in these times is that actually a lot of our staff, especially for those that potentially have been working more remotely during this year, potentially a lot of the messages that people have been getting have not been through our own communication channels. It's been through the media, it's been through local media, it's been through international media, and we've seen that play out in terms of people having different understandings and anxieties, or just a way of perceiving it, which might not be how we're intending to communicate in our workplace. But I think, again, it's just something to think about.
Yes.
The messaging, and some of it is coming from within and some is much wider.
So understanding that the language that we might use and even the ideas we might have will also be shaped by our worldview, and might be understood quite differently based on the worldview of the person that's receiving those messages. I think that's
really, that challenge of conflicting messages as well.
And finding the balance. So what about for you, Tofa? How does your worldview influence the way in which you lead and support the well-being of the people that you work with?
Well, as a Pacific, I will always view the world from my little window or big window, wherever you sit. So, and that's important for me as a Pacific leader in the organisation, you know, as GHBs. So when I go into a conversation where, you know, your view will be asked of, you give that view, but you also, for me, it's a respect that I must give, or I have, for the non-Pacific colleagues that I'm, you know, engaging with. And likewise, you know, it's the other way around. If you are a manager of Pacific, or Maori for that matter, Maori and Pacific staff, you must make an effort to understand how they view the world that you are in, because that's important. You know, it's not just a one-way thing. So understand how, why do we gather, you know, at church, or why do we, bring all the food all at once? So, you know, the thing is actually, those are the things, those are cultural things. And for us, you know, those are social connections that are important. It's also important before we even get here. It's important before we get into the four walls of our workplace. And as a manager of our workforce, understand that diversity, that brings back. And I think for me, you know, in my own journey is my own self-reflection. Are my views the only views? You know, so then you have to go into the conversation with that open mind, because you are not working just to serve your community. You are here to serve, you know, the whole community. So, and I think, you know, one of the things that we have done in this last 6-7 months of being in a COVID, you know, world is we are breaking the silo, so to speak. You know, it's like I can talk to Chris about, what's on your radar in terms of this, and important to that is actually our visibility as leaders. And if you're a manager of, you know, hopefully that you are all from listening in this from health, make sure that you are visible as a leader and as a manager not only to your staff, but to other areas of the organization as well. So
really, I really love the way that you started with really recognizing your own place and what's important to you, and then being able to step forward from that to explore and to seek to understand and to really communicate with the people around you. So really lovely thoughts for some of our viewers. What about for you, Chris? Do you have some thoughts for leaders who might be working to increase their awareness and their understanding of their own worldview, and how this impacts on their ability to lead?
Yeah. Again, it's similar themes to Tofa. It's needing to have your own awareness, and then being able to be open and receptive to hearing other people's views, and their take on a situation. Again, I've said the word earlier, but I mean, we've seen a lot of, again, for all of us, we've all had different anxieties at different times during this last period of time. So I think we need to be very aware that while I may not be anxious in a situation, some of my staff may be, and I need to respect that and understand where that's coming from to be able to respond and not have my own assumptions. And that takes time and patience and resilience as a leader. I think, I just think from a health provider point of view, I think it's also really important to understand not only for the individuals that we're leading, but also for the services that we're all interacting with. Again, as Topher said, we've done a lot more probably reducing some of the silos during this last period. It's been fantastic between our hospital providers and our community providers. But it's also been really interesting, even within the same organisations, we've had some teams that have stood down services and staff may have gone totally working remotely from home, where some other services have been at the forefront of clinical care during that time and patient facing. And I think it's just important, again, to understand sometimes those decisions may have happened also because of our own anxieties or those people leading those services or the staff. So again, I think we're learning and we're probably asking a lot of the questions also now about why did we make some decisions? Things have happened so quickly in the last 6 months too. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to go back and just to kind of consider, actually, how did that happen? And, you know, if we did it again, would we do it that way? And I know for a number of us, we're probably doing that in a practical, you know, resurgence planning and all those types of things that'll be happening right now.
Yeah. And definitely, I think, thinking about that from the perspective of what were the drive, you know, what were the things that drove us to that decision, and some of them will be, as you say, about practical considerations and contingency planning, and some of them actually probably in the moment were the reaction to the anxiety of the time, of the thing that we were most frightened would happen and that we were trying to avoid if we possibly could.
Absolutely.
So having that awareness, it's really important. So Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist who studied the way that people respond during times of crisis, made what I think is a really useful observation. And he said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. So what I'm really interested in is understanding, and I'll start with you, Chris, is how do you create that space? How do you create the space to be able to respond rather than to react?
Easier said than done. I'm sure we've all can kind of review and think about things when, you know, you would have liked to have taken more of a moment than you did. But again, even during this last period of time, there are only very few times when we need to make a decision on the spot. I think a lot of the time we may think we need to make a decision on the spot, but it may be our own pressure we're putting on ourselves, or we think because we're in this leadership role, we should always have the answers at every, you know, able to spout, and that's not reality. It's not the way we work as humans. So I think in terms of giving ourselves the space, it's giving yourself permission to not always have the instant answers. As leaders, quite often the answers don't come from you, it comes from your team around you. So I use that as a ploy to get yourself out of answering. But I think it's also just been about being open and saying potentially, I don't have the answer right now, I just need to go away. Agree on a time frame. It might be, you know, a 5-minute time frame, or it might be actually I can get back to you tomorrow. So again, some of those practical things and open communication. So maintaining those channels, and it sounds like actually almost extending your brain out to your extended team and your network in order to create that space. What about you, Topher? How do you create that space for yourself?
Similar to Chris, I think, you know, it's if you have experience in negotiation, and if the training to be negotiator, it's okay to sleep over it, to sleep over a decision. So that's the way that I, you know, take the time. And I think I'm not a great responder, you know, when things are, you know, heated. So one of the things that I always say is, we need to take this offline and I will ring you. But it's also like for us, it's actually to be deliberate in making the phone call back to the staff because he or she is waiting. It's just like we consider asking our own CEs about what we need and want, you know, and expecting the answer. We must also accord that respect to those who we manage. So it's really important that that is, that's how I respond, in terms, which basically brings you back to the time. It's a time thing. You need to reflect, and taking the time to actually think about it. And Chris talked about, quite often the answer doesn't come from you as a leader. It comes from the support that you have in the teams that you have. So, and it may be, sometimes you're just going to influence your colleague about the answer that you need to give. So that's the importance of having to take time and take, not necessarily, 2 or 3 days, because I'm always thinking, oh, somebody's waiting for the answer, so that's really important for me, is actually, I can respond to you, take this offline, I will ring you, follow that up, so that's how I, sort of, rather than react, do these,
Take that
2 or
time.
3 things.
Can I just, sorry, add another thing, just while you're talking, Topher. Another thing that I think has been quite, it's quite interesting to explore as well, is that we've been in a period of time where some decisions have need to be made by, chain of command. And actually, it's also probably okay for us as leaders to go, actually, I'm not the right leader for that situation, because this is the way I work. And it might be you actually delegate to one of your team members and say, you work really well in that type of model and that type of pressure cooker. And actually putting the right people in the right places and being okay about, actually, it might not be you.
So reflecting on that as well.
Yeah.
As part of how you create a safe environment for everyone to operate. I think the other one that comes up for me is actually in the moment, and both of you mentioned that it's really hard, isn't it, when there's high emotion, people feel very passionately about what they're talking about, and you can feel in yourself, you can feel the emotions coming out. You might be, you've got that kind of tension and the breathing's going and all of that. And I guess I'd make a plug for the value of the micro pause as well. So sometimes, and hopefully often, you can take a step out and take your time to compose yourself and find the right answer. But when you're in the heat of the moment, there's huge value in recognizing those emotions, recognizing that kind of physiological wind up, and just taking a two or three breaths to slow yourself down, give yourself that space so that you can, even in a micro sense, respond rather than react. And that whatever comes out of your mouth following that aligns with your values and how you would want to be communicating, rather than being a bit more of a knee-jerk kind of fight or flight kind of response. So having said that, I'm sure all of you, like me, will have had probably many opportunities, as I have, to reflect and learn on situations where it hasn't quite gone to plan, where I have made the wrong assumption, or I've reacted without giving myself that time to find the right response. And things have gone a bit haywire. So I'm really interested, I'm starting to Topher this time, to get a sense of what you found helpful when you've needed to repair, restore, or recover a relationship when it's gone a bit wrong.
Yeah, I think, well, I know this is what I do. Nothing beats a conversation. So you take the conversation, to the best level that you can find comfortable. Not necessarily about you, but it's actually about the person, your staff. And I think, go into that conversation with no preconceived ideas. Take it as it is presented to you, because it's the respect that you have for that, the staff itself. So conversation face to face is so important, in breaking whatever it needs to, so to follow. And, it's also good for us as managers and as leaders, to front that face to face, because it's not just because of your experience or your learning, but it's actually helping the staff understand, the issues that's been raised. So I think, that's the first thing, it's a human connection. To your staff, to the people around you, that's so important. And I'll tell you what, when I was, making my way up the ladder, that was more important to me, because then I know that my manager cares, So when we talk about well-being, this is what we do, it's like people say, oh, it's fluffy, soft and all that sort of, but every one of us must take that, that seriously about that connection to the other person, So, yeah.
And it always makes me laugh when people talk about soft skills in terms of people skills, because I defy anyone to tell me how easy it is when you've screwed up to go in and have that conversation and make the apology and try to repair that relationship. So that's my own little pet thing on that one. Chris, how about for you? When you've had opportunities where you've had to repair, restore, what have you found helpful?
I think first of all, it's been brave and acknowledging. So being able to say to your staff, I just had to think about that conversation we had the other day. Sorry about how that went. It didn't go well. I was a bit heated up. I suppose just being able to have that acknowledgement, and I think that goes a really long way. So acknowledging that potentially you didn't do, the interaction didn't come very well from your end. And I think thinking about a solution-focused approach going forward. And like Topa, I think it's all about having that conversation face-to-face if you can. Definitely not on the email. The dangers of email. So leading in this way, listening and seeking to understand, creating space to respond rather than to react, and attending to wellbeing is key to leadership. Takes energy and it takes resilience. And as leaders, many of us have really super busy lives. We're often interacting with lots of people during the course of the day, and we may not even work physically, as these guys have described, in the same location as our people. What have you found, Chris, has been helpful in keeping those connections with people? And you've mentioned a few things earlier. Is there anything you'd like to add into that? No, I think again, we've talked about the forums and the ability to have team meetings. I think it's also, for some staff, there are going to be things that are coming at you now and then, and they need to know they can still get in touch with you if you're not present with them. So I think having some informal structures too, it might be that you've got an agreement with your staff that, hey, I'll send you a text, and I'll let you know if I need to hear from you today, or it's a FYI for your information. I think those things work really well in my space.
So putting a little bit more detail into the communication so that people don't just know what it is, but also what it means.
So I could do it, plug there. So for those that use the ISBAR format, those kind of structured communication methodology can be really helpful. So you actually, if I'm a busy leader, that my staff are giving me a really clear, concise message that I know what they need from me, what the request is.
Okay, anything you've got to add to that?
Well, when you finish all that communication, you'll be hungry. So, you can't beat food. I think that's the thing. We innate in all of us is the spirit of hospitality. And I think, sometimes we forget that, but that's one way of connecting, to your staff. And if your staff are familiar of the way that you do these things, of course they will talk. Of course they will come and share. Of course they will do that. But that, it's just that it's different from what we do normally, So offer the morning tea or the afternoon tea or whatever, those are things that we do. We do it at home. We do it outside work. But, often we say, oh, there's no budget or so and so. What's wrong with, baking and then bringing in? So, I guess those are the things that's important. But the other thing for us as leaders is actually you're listening to the story, but you must be prepared to hear. I think that's quite, there's something that, sometimes I'm listening, but I'm not hearing what, the gentleman is trying to. Well, he said it very well, but, we're busy with our roles. There's a whole lot of things that come to play, but ensure, as a manager, you are hearing the issues that's been raised with you and follow that up. And like all other connection and all other things that are available to us, make sure you use that. Because that's about communications. That's about, respecting and hearing of what the issues are from each other.
It sounds like it's taking that idea of communication up another level to be about connecting. And we're nearly out of time, but I've just got one more question I'm going to squeeze in, and that is recognising that this does take a lot of energy. How do you maintain your energy? How do you restore your reserves?
I sing, so those are the things that you don't do at work, but you have to be deliberate in doing one or two things. So I sing and walk my dog. So those are the things that restore my energy. And of course, you're involved in many other things, but you have to pick out two. And of course, we have two grandsons who we adore the most. So that gives energy and saps energy as well. But enjoy what you have outside work. because that brings that extra energy into how you think, how you do, and how you relate to people, you know, in your work.
And for you, Chris, how do you restore and recharge?
Yeah. Probably two key things for me: sleep. I'm definitely one of these people that needs a good 8 to 9 hours sleep. So and all of us need good sleep. So as we know, so sleep would be number one for me, and human connectedness. So at work and at home, I know if I have a day at work where I'm really stuck in the office and the door's shut, I go home probably more zapped. Whereas if I even have a busy day like that, but make myself go out and just go down to a different floor or go and talk to some staff, actually just that connectedness gives me some energy as well.
Cool. So this brings us to the end of today's webinar, where we've explored the concept that when we're weathering life's storms, we're not all in the same boat. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I've really appreciated the wise words and the great stories that Chris and Topher have shared with us. I hope this has given you some new ideas to consider and some tips to support you in your practice leading for wellbeing. Thank you again to the panel, Chris and Topher, and thank you to those of you who've joined us today, not just for taking the time to tune in, but for the care and the commitment that you bring to your work every day. E noho rā.